Good evening, viewers, and welcome back to Candid Talk. Today's episode is entitled Evening Raag, and our guest is Amit Chaudhuri. He's a novelist, poet, essayist, literary critic, editor, music composer, singer, and an activist in more ways than one. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, he is also a professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia. His work over the years has received numerous accolades, including the Commonwealth Writers Prize, Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Petty Trask Award, the Sahitya Akademi, Rabindra Puruskar, and the Infosys Prize for Humanities in Literary Studies, and doubtless many more to come. Amit, good evening and very warm welcome to our show. So, Amit, when I was just reading through the introduction, it seems almost as if one is not talking about one human being, but several. And I'm wondering whether that had something to do with something like a childhood dream. Like, what is it that you wanted to be when you were a child?
When I was a child, I think the first thing that I remember wanting to be was a chauffeur, a driver. And I had a particular kind of driver in mind. His name, I think, was Sushil. So this was when my father was in Calcutta before we moved to Bombay. Mm-hmm. And we lived then in New Alipur, and the person who drove the car was called Sushil, I think. And I think I adored him. I liked him a lot. And in fact, when people used to ask me my name at that age, I used to say, Sushil. My name is Sushil. So he was my first idol. And later on, I didn't have particular people I looked up to. It was more, I suppose, power, might, and strength that I fantasized about. So I wanted to be a policeman or a police inspector or a commander in the army or a commander in chief. I remember the significance that particular title or appellation had for me, commander in chief. So those were the things that I began with. However, I have to say that I did start writing doggerel or verse very, very early on, and I enjoyed that. And my parents, were happy I was doing that. I think that this writing of verse was directly connected to the fact, or my interest in writing, whether it was story or verse, was directly connected to the fact that I didn't know any English when I was 3 or 4 years old. I didn't know any English at all. Mm-hmm. So when I was admitted to Cathedral and John Connors School, which is a school in Bombay, mm-hmm. I was completely without English, and the headmistress of the infant school said to my mother, "Give him Ladybird books to read, give him comic books to read, and he'll pick up English in a couple of weeks." And it did happen in that way, that I began to read these Ladybird books about John and Jack and Jane going to the beach. And I discovered comic books, and I began to read in English. I learned English, and then I began to write stories in it. And I think partly the delight of writing at that time derived from my having picked up this language, which I didn't know earlier. So, right. So quite early on, there was this kind of this treatment of writing as a kind of adventure.
And would it be fair to say that versification came earlier to you and more naturally when you were starting off writing?
I wrote more verse than I did stories, I think. Though I don't know if there was a clear distinction in my head
Mm-hmm.
to do with hierarchy as to which one was better. I liked writing stories as well. I mean, English was the only subject that I was any good at in school, and English composition is something that I enjoyed doing until I got too bogged down in my adoration of Enid Blyton and didn't mature as a writer at a certain age, and kept churning out for too long Enid Blyton imitation stories. But in school, poetry had no place. I mean, except as something you studied from a textbook. I mean, the idea of writing poetry was a complete, was outside the bounds of a schoolboy's imagination. And so, if
Mm-hmm.
one actually did it, if one actually wrote poetry, it had to be kept a secret from the class, from one's friends, and from school. Um, so I did write poetry. I continued to write poetry. I'll tell you one thing, Avik. So can't remember when, around the age of 12, my parents, my father sent off two of my poems to this weird magazine for army people, and I have no idea how he had even heard of this magazine. A magazine called Sainik Samachar. Sainik Samachar. I think it was an English language magazine. And two poems were accepted by Sainik Samachar and published there. My parents were very proud because, otherwise I was academically, I'm not doing particularly well in school. There was nothing to sort of hold up
Mm-hmm.
as achievement on my part. I was uninterested in sports and completely uninterested in study. So these poems appearing in Shoinik Samachar was taken to be a great achievement.
Great
And
achievement.
yeah, and my parents showed my teacher, my English teacher, the poems. My English teacher, Mrs. Nair, who at that time thought I was, I wrote good compositions, but was stuck with Enid Blyton and was going to go nowhere as a student. She liked the poems, so they had the desired effect. But they kind of outed me as a poet in class, because then Mrs. Nair announced to the class
Mm-hmm.
that I'd written some beautiful poems, and this was something that made me quail with embarrassment and fear, because I was trying to also inculcate a tough guy kind of pose at that point, at the age of 12, to impress the girls,
Right.
and not studying played well into that kind of tough guy persona that I was trying to inculcate.
But wouldn't that have given you a reason to sort of bask in glory, where nowhere, would your compatriots, would your classmates dream of writing anything, let alone
They looked
publishing?
at me suspiciously. I mean, they knew that I was good at English, which invoked mixed feelings in them. They felt that this was something to be admired to a point,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and um, and after that, I needed to be looked upon with a degree of skepticism, or as a particular kind of species, not entirely normal, slightly anomalous. Now, on top of that, for me to be sort of declared a poet, had me open to this kind of, not ridicule, but deep suspicion. Ridicule only from one of my close friends, who, after having discovered I was a poet, I think decided that a lot about me had been suddenly explained to him. I mean, why I was the way I was.
Right.
And he began to call me poet, in fact, with slight contempt. Yeah, I think what he might have had in mind was my unwillingness to fit in with, and he was a misfit himself, and also my unwillingness to do sports. And my unwillingness to do sports didn't come so much from an ingrained dislike of sports, but an ingrained dislike of both competition and the star system. because in my school, in Cathedral School, the star system revolved around sports, achievement in sports rather than academics.
And we were talking earlier sometime, you told me a very interesting anecdote of how you managed to wriggle out of the physical education classes.
Did I tell you that? Okay. I wriggled out of physical education classes using a couple of excuses. One was not so serious, but both for me had no seriousness beyond being used as being a convenient excuse to skip PE. First one was I think when I was 10 years old in the 5th standard, and I was getting these coughs and colds of late, and my mother had said in exasperation, "12 মাস ওর সর্দি কাশি থাকে, আর ভাল লাগে না, 12 মাস সর্দি কাশি." So so I said to my PE teacher, "I can't do PE today," and he said, "What's wrong with you?" Because I was completely normal as far as he could see. So I said, so he said, I told him, no, I once fell ill for 12 months. So he said, 12 months? No, that's a bad illness. Okay, you sit down, and and I sat down and I kept sitting. The other one, which also was great as an excuse, was the fact that I had a heart murmur, which had been detected when I was 3.5 years old. I had a congenital heart problem, which was finally sorted out through open heart surgery when I was in Cambridge, teaching there at the age of 36. But it was an extremely useful excuse to miss PE. For me, this heart murmur obviously caused my parents a lot of distress. I was asymptomatic, so it didn't matter to me. It was just a good excuse with which to miss PE. So that was the second excuse.
So going back to your verses, did you at any point of time whilst you were at school write in Bangla?
No, because I grew up in Bombay, and right. I was taught. I didn't even know English till I went to school. So I used to speak in Hindi and Bengali, but I didn't know how to write Bengali. So I used to speak in Hindi and Bengali with my parents and with the people who worked in a house till I was 4, 5, at the age of 4.5 or 5. I can't remember which. I picked up English. My mother was intent that I be able to read and write Bengali. So she would employ teachers to teach me Bangla. But I've just told you a little earlier that I hated studying. So I hated, I didn't do any studies at school. So it's very unlikely that I would suddenly become a studious boy at home, because home was a place where I was supposed to have no kind of, no compulsions to work at all. My mother, however, did get people to teach me at home, Bangla at home. Unfortunately, the Bangla teachers turned out to be themselves kind of somewhat challenged in their knowledge of Bengali. So I remember one lady who was a Bengali, but like me had grown up in Bombay largely, or other cities outside of Bengal. And my mother used to spy on these teachers to see what they were up to. So my mother came in and large-eyed, looked up upon the lesson as it was progressing, and I said to this teacher, actually she's well known in another field, or fairly well known, as it turned out. I won't mention her name. So so I asked this teacher, "Kopat maneki? What is kopat?" So this teacher pointed to the cupboard, which and my mother said, okay, gently sort of decided to change teachers. Then another man came, and he was a Maharashtrian. and deeply in love with Bangla and the Bengali language. But
So it
his
was a
knowledge,
Maharashtrian teaching you Bangla.
yeah. So somebody who taught Bangla in Bombay. There was a lot of interest in Bengali literature and the Bengali language among Maharashtrians and Gujaratis. Very, very serious kind of interest and in the Tagore song as well. If you remember, Alka Yagnik, I think a playback singer, she began her career as a performing artist on television in Bombay as a singer of Tagore songs, which she picked up in Bombay. So anyway, to go back to this teacher, very nice man, Maharashtrian. So my mother again came in and she was observing the lesson from the wings, and this teacher said, "Dhono dhanne pushpe bhara." No, he said, "Dhono dhanne pushpe bhora," etc., etc. Jano ki likheche? So I said, "No, I'm Jaina." So he said, "Otul Prasad." So again, there came a change of teachers. So this continued to happen for a while. Just before I went to England as an undergraduate, I was taught by a man called Mihir Lal Mitro. He was a physicist in Bombay at I think the Bhabha Institute or whatever, the atomic research thing. Very nice man. I can take his name therefore without any compunction. And he got me really interested. At that time, I was anyway becoming much more seriously interested in literature. He got me interested. And at that point, briefly, I began to write in Bangla. I began to write prose poems in Bangla. And then I went to England and I lost that kind of, that facility that I was just beginning to pick up.
And if you look back upon those works, those pieces today, would you regard them as juvenilia, or for a person who was 15 or 16 years old, were they quite mature? The Bangla poems.
I wrote them when I was about 17, 18, 19, just before I went off to England. And it's the same time when I was also composing songs and writing songs as a songwriter, playing the guitar and composing songs, writing poetry. I was reading things that I didn't completely understand, but Baudelaire, the modernists, in English, pretending to write like them, imitating them, going through an apprentice period. So the Bengali work at that time would have been apprentice work, but I think it would have been of interest. It wouldn't be mature work, but it wouldn't quite be juvenile. It wouldn't quite be, it would be apprentice work, but of some interest. I wish I could find them. They're lost now.
Yeah. So in terms of music, you said you started recording songs and writing songs and playing them on the guitar. So there would have been definitely a period of apprenticeship when you learned music seriously. So take us through that.
So with music, I was kind of, well, my mother was a great singer. So that was there at home. The idea of the beauty of timbre, of tone, of voice, and of pitch. That was a given. And also, given the kind of mother I had, and what we listened to, so the centrality of the voice. But then I was becoming interested also not interested, I mean, that was my world in Bombay: Western pop music, Western rock music, rock and pop, American folk. So American folk, that immediately presupposed the guitar, and so I wanted to learn the guitar, and I began to learn. Well, I'll tell you what. I began to learn the guitar from someone called Bonnie DaCosta or somebody, I can't remember his name, in something called Bombay Music School, if I remember correctly, on Bridge Candy.
Okay.
I began to learn it with with a friend of mine, Ajay Chaudhuri. Um, Ajay will not mind me saying he loves my music, but he won't mind me saying that he was not a musician. He's not musically talented. Both of us went to Bombay Music School or whatever it was called, and we had to learn how to read music. So we began to take this course, learning how to read music through deeply boring compositions, like Lightly Row. That was one of them. Lightly row, pa 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 pa, lightly row. Something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Something quite sort of puerile, juvenile.
Yeah, I'd learn the notes for this song and follow these notes of a song had no interest in. I began to find Ajay, because he was putting his mind to it, and learning how to read notes is a kind of technicality to begin with, was racing ahead in front of me, learning the guitar. So I thought, this is not for me. I mean, here I am with a friend of mine who's not a musician, or is not musically talented. We're stuck with this whole technical business of reading notes. And I'm not going to be doing anything very much. And Ajay is going to go ahead and start reading notes and think he's a musician. I better move out of here. So I moved out of there, and I ran into somebody who began to teach me guitar and chords. And soon after that, I learned how to play the guitar. And I began to write songs around the time when I was 15 or 16 with my own chords. And then I joined junior college, Elphinstone College, and somehow won the talent competition, where this guy, Nandu Bhende, who played Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar, a really good singer in Bombay. And, even now people remember him. He was there in the audience. Sorry, not in the audience. He was the sole judge. And I had decided to play one of my own songs, one of my own compositions. I was 16 years old. The composition was called Shout. And I had composed it in a kind of opaque Jethro Tull manner, But it's a good song. So I went up to the stage, and there were 200 people, mainly ruffians and others in the audience. And the moment I said shout, they began to heckle me. Shout, shout, they began to heckle me, and I began to sing, and then they stopped heckling me and they were listening. And then they burst into applause. Now, the other thing to say about that performance, when I won first prize, was that I completely forgot my words. So I was mimicking kind of phonetic sounds and singing away. But I think Bhende liked something, or maybe he felt pressured by the audience reaction. No, actually, it was a good song. He gave me the prize. A man called Sanjay Ghosh, who then later on became a kind of activist, and he was kidnapped by Alpha and he was killed. I don't know if you remember that. He was in college, 2 years older than me, and he took me to All India Radio, and he got me to sing. So I used to do these kind of occasional broadcasts on All India Radio of my own compositions, until they realized that, hang on, this guy's not singing a Carpenter's or a Neil Diamond song. He's doing something pretty peculiar, singing his own compositions. And then they asked, do you sing any well-known songs? And I said, no, I only sing my own songs. And then suddenly the invitation stopped. But by that time, I'd got into Hindustani classical music, which then I continued to do. That became what I did as far as music was concerned for a very, very long time. And to the present day.
And even now, and right up to the present day. So tell me about the process of immersing yourself in classical music, because that would have been a completely different journey from pop music and learning how to play chords.
Yes. The process was in this way, that you first become, they say about the process of writing or creating or thinking about art, At first, your eyes must open to what's around you. You know, things that you never noticed before or considered too ordinary to be interested in, you suddenly realize as being infinitely interesting. And a kind of art for the first time emerges from this noticing of the world. You know, that happened to me when I was around 23 or so. I first began to notice the world. Something similar happened as far as Hindustani classical music was concerned. That something I thought of as just being peculiar sounds suddenly became to me the essence of beauty itself. And that happened when I was 16. And I suddenly began to listen anew to what had always been around me, but I never listened to. And Kishori Amonkar, Bhimsen Joshi on Marathi programs, listening to them for the first time. Vishwadev Chatterjee records. Bal Gandharva, the singer of Natya Sangeet, again poaching on Marathi television programs. And then I'm thinking, and then Govind Prasad Jaipurwala, my mother's new teacher, this great singer of Hindustani classical music, who was at that time teaching her bhajans, devotionals. Suddenly made me think, my goodness, this is so beautiful and so fluid and so fluent that nothing ever happens in the same way twice in this form of beauty. That you have a phrase, and then when it happens again, it is different.
It's reinvented. It's not just performed, but it's reinvented afresh every single time.
From moment to moment, yeah. And I thought, how can I do this? How can I achieve that fluidity and mastery of change? And the moment I began to do it, I realized it is extremely difficult to do. It's even difficult to sing Saregama Padhanisa as my guru wanted me to sing it. You know, it's not just notes. Saregama Pa. It's not like that. He used to sing it like Saregama Padhanisa Sanida Pa Magaresa. You see, it's connected by me. This is gamak. It's coming from me, but it has to come from the first not as in Western classical music.
So they're not discrete staccato, but they're sort of blended into each other.
Here, it's a ligament. It's a continuous kind of movement. That had to be mastered. It seems easy now to sing it, but that had to be mastered. This movement, this continuous movement from sa to the upper sa, without break, through this kind of pulling of a string. What in Western blues music is called the bent note. You pull a string to get the bent note. You can't achieve it by going across the fret. In the blues, the guitarist can create one bent note by pulling it. But you know, a gaiki ang sitaria can produce 5. They are trying to do what the voice is doing. That is not going up across the fret to run through discrete notes one after the other, but allow one note to generate the next one and the one after that. Whether you do it on a string or on the voice, this is difficult to do. It has to be mastered in the first place before you go to other things. So with that began this whole business of practice, riyaz, practicing for hour after hour.
And when you were in England, because you went there to do your bachelor's in London, and then you remained in England up until your DPhil. So that was quite a protracted period of time. So during this time, how were you able to sustain your riyaz, like entirely on your own?
Battling it out. So by the time I went to England, I had stopped playing Western music and I'd stopped listening to Western music, and the music around. I'd had a complete shock anyway, a spiritual shock with the advent of disco. Um, that it was like apocalypse had happened,
Mhm.
and the world had fallen. And then I went to England, and around me was Lionel Richie singing Hello, and Culture Club, and Duran Duran, and I shut it all out, and I just began to do riyaz all the time. I had to battle to do riyaz because um, houses in England are porous, sound moves up and down. So my neighbors could hear me. I was mortified that they could hear me, but at the same time, I had to say to myself, well, too bad, I have to practice, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
I couldn't help it that I couldn't help the fact that I slept at 3 o'clock in the morning and woke up at midday or after midday. I had to get up and practice at 9:30 or whenever it was. I thought it was a decent hour to be practicing. And it was a different time, Obik. It was like 1983. Their ears had not got used to difference in music. Um,
Mhm.
Today, I think they would be slightly more accommodating. You know, the blues had taught Western musicians by the late 60s to be able to listen to other kinds of sound, especially Indian music, because there were commonalities in approach there, uh,
Mhm.
such as there aren't between, let's say, a hidebound version of Western classical music and Indian music. But between the blues, I mean, there's a preparation tonally and orally for what Western music, Indian music does. It's kind of it's the way it moves between notes. But in spite of that, I think there was prejudice against a difference in music, and
Mhm.
and this prejudice is not only a white prejudice. Its prejudice was there and is still there probably among Indians who still don't realize, many of them, just how beautiful what they think is alien, that is Indian classical music, is. Just how beautiful it is. It would just take something very small to open their eyes to it, just as it did for me, at
For
the age
you.
of 16.
And whilst in England, surely there was no prejudice to the new kind of writing that you were doing and that was coming out from you. Tell us
Well,
about that flowering.
well, when I was in England as an undergraduate, I never went to college. I was at University College London, and I'm famous at University College London for never having been to college. And even now, they do speak about it. And so I only mention this to say that I'm not making it up. I stopped going to college, and I watched daytime TV, and I watched and I did my riyaz. Uh, I might have done other things which were slightly, which I shouldn't mention over here. But I didn't do studies till right at
Mhm.
the end. And I wrote poetry. I continued to write poetry, um, and by now, but I was still writing apprentice poetry. I was still trying to be T.S. Eliot or whoever it was, Philip Larkin.
Mhm.
So, Ezra Pound. It didn't matter. Every week it was
It
a
was somebody
different
else, right?
period. It was a different somebody else in a different period in history, a different persuasion, maybe,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
Larkin couldn't stand Pound. That didn't matter to me. I just moved from one to the other seamlessly. Um, but um, but at the age of 23, I wrote a poem called Saint Cyril Road. And this St. Cyril Road was the road that my parents had moved to after my father's retirement. It was a road in Bandra. And it was the first place that, outside of Bhawanipur in Calcutta, where I encountered a sense of locality and I
Mhm.
understood modernism's preoccupation with what Lawrence called the spirit of place. The spirit of place is something that emerges as a preoccupation among writers by the early 20th century, or maybe the late 19th, according to him, in American literature. I encountered the spirit of place in Cyril Road, and I wrote a poem for the first time about not some transcendental suffering or some great historical event, but about this road I used to visit when I used to go back home then for my holidays to visit my parents. And so it was the first time that I allowed myself to write about something that was absurd. And the absurd was, how can you write a poem about St. Cyril Road? One should surely be writing about proper literary subjects. St. Cyril Road was not a proper literary subject. I think that was the first time I wrote a real poem. And it did come out in the London Review of Books in 1986. It was the first time that something of mine came out in a national journal in the UK.
And perhaps again, my sense is that was because this was not just truly original voice or an original piece. It reflected a lived-in experience, as opposed to, okay, this is a poem in the manner of Pound, and the next week it could be back to Eliot, and then it could be fast forward to Ted Hughes, and so forth.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It sort of was about what I could see from my balcony and where that balcony was situated. And none of this, until that moment when I wrote it, would I have considered significant enough as subject matter for writing, for literature. And even today, I would have to kind of counter those who think, and there are legions of such people who do not think such things are important enough for this domain we call literature. They mistake literature as being something akin to a science or to history or a form of knowledge where we already know in a predetermined way what's important. That kind of issue has already been solved for us, and we go to read in literature a depiction of what we already know to be important. I would counter that by saying that literature is precisely not knowing what is significant and finding it is that space of reassigning what is significant and what is insignificant. What seems deeply significant to the man who reads the newspaper and deeply insignificant to the same person in a poem might become the other way around. What seems deeply significant there becomes deeply insignificant. And what seems deeply insignificant there becomes very significant. And this is what this realignment, this radical realignment, this revolutionary realignment is what the arts does, not just literature, but cinema and the other arts too. So to write about St. Cyril Road was already to go towards a place where I would have to counter this idea of what literature was.
Because it's also the case, isn't it, that this other school of thought, which is talking about, a predetermined framework or structure of this is significant, this is important, this is literature, and this is not, that kind of a teleology completely bars you from exploring possibilities, right? And exploring new spaces. Going back to St. Cyril Road for a minute, Amit, looking back at not just that poem, but the other poems that morphed out of that initial piece over the years, right? And eventually led to the collection. Would you say that in your own way, St. Cyril Road was perhaps your version in verse of, say, Naipaul's Miguel Street?
No, why not? Because Naipaul, yes, because Naipaul's Miguel Street it also emerges from this experience of a man, and this is from real life.
Exactly.
The beginning of Miguel Street is from life. Is a kind of memory transposed into a moment. And the moment comprises this, where a man looks out from the balcony and the man on the opposite side is close enough in the street to hear him say, "What happening out there, Hat?" or something like that. And the man says, "What happening out there, Bogart?" The names are Bogart and Hat.
Yeah.
And there is enough proximity there for the words to carry in either direction. And this is an extraordinary moment of pointless communication, which is full of joy. And it creates a space, it creates a geography without any description.
Because it's just in there, right? I mean, there is joy, there's humor, there's ritual, there's identity. Because the person who's called Bogart, obviously he's an expat Indian who has a completely different name, and he's had other appellations, he's had other monikers previously, right? And now the new one, Bogart, after Humphrey Bogart, right, the Hollywood star, is what sticks with him. So there's a kind of implicit sort of identity as well with that man. You talked about moment, right? And I think this is a good segue into the next sort of theme that we want to take up in our conversation. At which point of time did you think that in literature, and particularly in your own writing, capturing the moment or thinking about it or really obsessing over it, when did it become important, and what was your approach?
I think from St. Cyril Road onwards, the poem and the series of poems I wrote about St. Cyril Road, and I realized then, but I think I must have already realized as a reader that, and as a human being, that the present moment was where everything that meant anything to me happened. And when I say meant anything to me, again, what I mean by that is mysterious even to myself, because it cannot be encompassed by, that's when I, the first day I did this, or when I became that. It's none of that narrative of what meant most to you. So whatever this category is, whatever this experience is of excitement, I mean, even more than meaning, let's call it excitement. This excitement exists in the moment. It does not exist to do with, something pristine in the past, or something that's sort of to be idealized in the future. It's something that is unfinished, and exists very briefly, and that's where the excitement is. It is to do with excitement. The excitement, though, is a momentary excitement. So anyway,
and we're also talking about, again, when we're talking about the moment, right? You worked out your own methodology, and you said it elsewhere, but particularly in our one-on-one conversations in the past, you've often stressed on the importance to you of a paragraph, right? And how that was infused with possibility. So if you can share that with the viewers.
Yeah, the paragraph, I mean, well, the paragraph, because I became a prose writer, I suppose it is kind of possible to stay with the moment in poetry to a greater extent than it is in prose, because especially in prose narrative and fiction, you have what is expected is some kind of superstructure to do with the unfolding of a life and everything that goes into that unfolding. But I found that my interest in the momentary is something I needed to express through a narrative form like the novel, but that I needed to make the novel not primarily a narrative form, but a form that allowed multiple experiences or openings out into the moment. And I suppose the novel presented many problems as to how it might be possible for a writer to do this, but also did provide one with a structure and opportunity with which to do this in a way that is slightly different from the poem. Slightly different from the poem, a novel in which nothing happens, ostensibly, but which comprises multiple instances of this opening out, this fleeting excitement in the unnoticed. So the novel allows a space for that. It immediately presents a problem as well as to how to organize these things. When if there's a plot, if there's a story, if there's a narrative, then there is a sequence of things.
Then there's a storyline.
Yeah. What sequence does this kind of moments of encountering the unnoticed, what sequence does that have? And how does one deal with that in what is basically a narrative form, a sequential form? Here the paragraph is of interest because I saw every paragraph. Again, I noticed that the most exciting paragraphs in the novel were the opening paragraphs. The paragraph that open the novel, or the paragraphs on the opening page or the opening pages. And here, because narrative had not settled in and there was no narrative compulsion, and everything had to do with a sense of irresolution where things are beginning in the middle of something. They're not beginning at A, but they're beginning somewhere. It could be in the afternoon or at dawn. They're beginning there. And there's a sense of irresolution. Nothing has happened yet. Maybe a man is sitting there or a woman is emerging from a door, but nothing has happened yet. And here, the writer is at their most free, and the writer and the reader both feel the greatest sense of excitement that has an excitement that has everything to do with potential and nothing to do with plot or what happens next. Here, the excitement has nothing to do with what happens next. The excitement of the opening pages, the opening paragraphs. It has all to do with possibility, potentiality, the potential. And this is marvelous. This potential that the moment has. To domesticate it into something that says, well, then the man, got up from the chair and then he went to work and he met with the boss whom he blah, blah, blah had never liked. And he thought, I'm going to resign today. And in fact, he did hand in his resignation at 5 o'clock. All that's what the novel is generally made up of. But then you go back to the first page and he's sitting on the chair, scratching his stubble. And then a certain kind of writer like myself thinks, how long can I stay with moments like that, where the rest of it hasn't happened? Because that moment seems to me full of some kind of energy. How long can I stay with that energy? So I had to figure that out. I had to figure out how to make novels that were composed of basically of opening paragraphs, which I then had to put together into a semblance of sequence or story, but also allow them to maintain or have that unresolved energy of something about to begin. That they would continue to have that somehow.
So does it sadden you, disappoint you, therefore, that whenever you're starting a novel or any kind of a narrative, there are these paragraphs that are opening up sort of not just germs, but different kinds of possibilities that can blossom out all over the place, and then eventually, towards the back end or when you're about to complete the novel, there has to be perforce some semblance of dovetailing into, okay, so this is what happened. I mean, even in a novel that ostensibly is not about.
The challenge I face is to keep that going, not to dovetail. To not dovetail, to be true to that kind of non-sequential experience of excitement. To never reach the end or a climax to avoid the climax, because everything that's of real interest lies outside of those climactic moments and outside of the story, to remain with those things that lie outside.
And to what extent would you say that your training and also your practice, your riwaz in Hindustani classical has influenced the phraseology of words that you use, or even the way that you sort of you have these little incidents? I will tell you one which is one of my favorites. In A New World, right, where Joyajit, on the face of it, it's completely banal. There's absolutely nothing taking place, right? A middling and middle-aged person who is a professor of economics in the US comes back to his native Calcutta and is waiting for the lift. That's it. He's just waiting for the lift to come to him in order to go downstairs, right? And this sequence is repeated through the book, and it seems to me, going back to your point, that every time, just the fact of it, the waiting for the lift, the experience in the lift, and going downstairs, either with a neighbor or without, every time it is the same event, but the alankar is different, or a gamak is different, or the certain configuration of the notes in that same phrase within the same rag is somewhat different, mutated every time.
Yes. I never sort of made these connections, especially, when I began to write novels or when I was writing a New World. It's only lately, in the last 2 or 3 years, that I realized that what improvisation in Hindustani classical music is evasion. I realized this actually not when a khayal was being sung, but when Mehdi Hassan, the ghazal singer, was singing a long, I think like a 25-minute version of a ghazal called Kaise Chupau Raaz-e Gham. Didaye tar ko kya karu. He kept playing around. Let's say he kept playing around with Kaise Chupau Raaz-e Gham. We knew he had to come to Didaye tar ko kya karu. We knew the tune there as well, because most of us, evasion, improvisation also depends on us, that the listener and the singer already being familiar with the tune. So it's not the newness of the tune that we are praising. It's what's being done to the tune, to the melody, to the rag, that is riveting. So over here we know the tune, but we want to see how far he can stretch that first bit before he arrives to the second. And in that stretching on and on of the first bit, and his refusal to come to the second, lies his creativity. All the creativity of this particular artist in that instance lies, and instant, or series of instants, lies in evasion. Evasion is creativity. The beauty of the evasion is what creates this kind of rapturous sense in us, that he disappointed us again, and this creates great ecstasy. He did not come to the point. He evaded the point again, and then the point is arrived at, and there's almost some disappointment that the point is arrived at.
That's right.
And then the whole matter of evasion begins again. This is something that I recognize now, after having thought through that Mehdi Hassan recital and thought through that, right, improvisation is evasion. That is what it is in Hindustani classical music. And then I thought, yes, but this is what I'm interested in also as a writer. And so over there, the two sensibilities and what they're drawn to maybe come together.
And would you say, Amit, do you believe that at a very fundamental level, there is an intrinsic synesthesia across all the arts, so across the visual arts, across music and literature? there's some sense of exploration which is innate and which is kind of
Possibly,
natural.
Bobby, but I would kind of, um, I would say these experiences are surprising and discontinuous as well, and that we must approach them thinking that they form some kind of wonderful
Mhm.
harmonious whole,
Harmony,
which expresses some kind of
like a deeper
humanity, which is
truth about human condition.
immediately comprehensible.
Mhm,
One must understand the human and spiritual energies that inform these things, inform what we are drawn to, and inform also what we dislike, and what we turn against. When we practice the arts. Um, but we must look upon the word universal uh, with suspicion, not an easy politically correct suspicion, but as something that sells short the actual variety of spiritual and creative energies that go into our experience of literary and musical and artistic histories, and practice.
mhm, mhm. Before we talk about your two forms of activism, literary and otherwise, we'll be talking about the Calcutta's heritage. Before we go there, you've done a very interesting project where you forayed beyond music and beyond literature into the visual art, and to be more precise, into the visual space. And that
Yeah.
has to do with sweet shops. So tell us
Right.
about that.
Um, I took about several years, 7 or 8 years before deciding I'd go ahead with this. You know, the impetus was this, that I would go to these sweet shops in Calcutta, and then at some point I suddenly began noticing the portraits of
Mhm.
the founders. Say, let us say Bhimnag. To take one example, there are many other examples one can mention. And these portraits are of men often from the 19th century. And I noticed that these portraits had a kind of gravitas about them. The men had a kind of gravitas about them that marked them out as men of this new secular modern world that was then emerging in the late 19th century in Bengal. And I
Mhm.
thought these people, these founders of sweet shops, could easily have also been, with their air of mystery, writers or social reformers or scientists. All the photographs of that time have that kind of that mystery and
Mhm.
gravitas.
Mhm.
So I thought, what can I do with this? And I thought I'd like to create a space in which we confront these portraits side by side, and confront this mystery, this the mystery of this gravitas of these people who are sweet shop owners, and and um, and smile at this, and at the same time feel moved by this incongruity, and and then I thought, but I'm not an artist. And would it be right for me now to do again, something else, and something I have no talent in or have no expertise in? So I think whenever you do something, whether it's composing a song or writing a poem or writing a book, you always embark on something you have no knowledge about. And this can be true as well of embarking on a new genre. And this is finally what I did after I gathered up enough courage.
Mhm.
I created an exhibition called the Sweet Shop Owners of Calcutta and
Okay,
Other
okay.
Ideas, in which I displayed these pictures, but I also um, displayed seven. There were three parts to the exhibition. One were the portraits of the sweet shop owners. The other one had to do with gifts that I'd been given for years, which I had never been able to put to any use. And I said to my wife one day, just hang on to that gift. Don't throw it away. I'm going to have an exhibition of unusable gifts, and this will be part of that exhibition. And at a certain point of time, I thought, this has to come true. I have to now do this exhibition. I now have enough gifts, and I had threatened her not to throw these things away. So they had been kept, but where neither of us could anymore tell. And both my parents had passed away by that time. So there were 7 unusable gifts, 12 portraits of sweet shop owners, and the last bit was, again, I got this kind of weird idea. You know these road signs, of metal road signs you see in Calcutta, and or anywhere in India, with names of streets or with edicts like cleanliness is next to godliness, or haste makes waste. Suddenly, I began to think that suddenly quotations from things I knew began to come to me. They range from taka mati mati taka to Holderlin's a line from Holderlin, and I began to think, full of merit, but poetically man dwells on the earth. This is Holderlin in English translation. I got the German original, and I began to put these things onto these signs, which got made, and it was a labor of love in Goriahat by its actual sign maker. So those were the 3 elements of the composition. This was, as is true of beginning my non-fusion music. This is not fusion. Beginning doing Hindustani classical, beginning to write a poem, beginning to write a novel even today. It was a testing of unknown waters. It was doing something you know nothing about. You know nothing about it. It pertains. It is as true of everything I've done as it is of this particular exhibition. That none of it I knew anything about when I began to do it.
And would you say that much of what we see in the globalized world around us, that you can define as, the appellation of the market, is all about casting boundaries and making sure that this is a boundary and these are elements within that where everything is known and that is propagated, and that is something that you have an aversion to, in much the same way that you had an aversion to Lionel Richie and Duran Duran back in the day.
That was slightly different, but I think with Lionel Richie, Duran Duran, there's a new synthetic kind of sound that was coming into being at that time. More and more of the work would be done through gradually, not still then, but it was beginning
increasingly
through studio work, computers, later digitization. The synthesizer was the first thing where you could produce, let's say, the sound of a string orchestra through a machine. And that kind of that slightly synthetic sound was audible.
Was jarring.
Anyway, but to go back to what? Sorry, what?
So we're talking about globalization, right? And
so
your reaction to that.
The markets, they certainly operate according to genre, and the market certainly sells things according to genres. And genre is defined by 2 things. Genre is defined by the last successful thing in that genre. So it must look like that. And other things include markers. So this has been around in Western thought for a very long time. It's a kind of identity politics, in the sense that something to do with the future will have a spaceship in it. This is the identity of the future. Something to do with the past will have a monument of a certain kind. That is the identity of the past. Something to do with children's writing will have broomsticks in it, or people wearing funny hats, or waving magic wands. That is the identity of a children's book. That creates genre, that facilitates marketing, but it also facilitates a kind of writing which is dependent upon these identifying markers. once you let go of the identifying markers and say that I'm going to write about the future, but it's not going to have any spaceships or men in kind of space suits, then there is panic. What is this future that you're talking about? And that is the proper question that should be raised by cinema or literature. What is this thing called the future? Let us leave aside what we already think we know. We do not know it any more than we know where we are now. We do not own any of these ideas to do with history or the future. So the solidifying of genres into things which exhibit markers of what they are do sort of are part and parcel of the marketing of certain categories.
And we see this all the time in malls and outlets where there is the mainstream, be that music, be that movies, and then you have the other, right? So that could be world music or world cinema or literary fiction if you straight into a bookshop, which is relegated inevitably to a corner of that large retail store, and inevitably less chic, less glamorous, possibly even less well lit than the rest of the store. Do you see this as a sort of very deliberate kind of marginalization that serious or at least free thinking individuals ought to be aware of?
This is very true, especially of chain bookstores in India. They seem to have gone down this route even more
very much,
than their counterparts in the UK or US. Although chain bookshops in the UK and US are also a complete nightmare. Because they're completely totalitarian entities directed by the market. They would put out there what is endorsed by the market. But when you talk about a bookshop selling CDs and greeting cards and stationery and novels and maybe a small section on poetry, what we are talking about is not only marginalization but equivalence. We create an equivalence between all these things. And that equivalence is at work in many domains, including, let's say, the literary festival. The literary festival has done a lot to use the term literary, but then hollow it out so that it can mean anything. And there is equivalence between, let us say, J.M. Coetzee and a great poet in the Oriya language, and Rahul Dravid and Javed Akhtar and whoever else it might be. There's equivalence in that on that plane, and to a person who is writing stories of poetry with any degree of seriousness, more than marginalization, this equivalence will be baffling. This new idea that everything is on the same plane. That will be baffling. I mean, I don't think a writer would grudge a cricketer or a film actor what they do. They would have respect for what they do. But this kind of this plane called the literary becoming a platform for equivalence, where in fact then the writer becomes an anachronism in this peculiar plane. It's as Dubravka Ugresic, the Croatian novelist and essayist, said when she was talking about Ivanka Trump, who then wrote a novel. So Ugresic said it was easy for a champion skier to become a novelist, but a novelist cannot become a champion skier, because the creative artist is stuck with the ontology of who they are, in a way that these domains no longer believe in. So to be, they used to say, she could have been nothing but a singer or nothing but a writer. She was born to be that. This now is an anachronism. Anybody, it seems, can be anything. There's a good side to that, but not when it becomes a marketing principle of this sort of equivalence that I'm talking about, when certain things become senseless.
Indeed. And before we end, would you like to talk about the state of affairs currently, where we are talking, particularly with regard to the cultural or the architectural heritage of Kolkata, and the work that you're doing on that front.
I want our amazing houses, whether in the north or the south of Calcutta, which are not designated heritage houses and which are not monuments, because the monuments are most often the least interesting buildings, but they do have heritage tags sometimes, or we know them as historical monuments. But it's the houses that people live in most often that have had the most kind of the greatest architectural heterogeneity and heterogeneity peculiar to this city. And this happened from the 19th century onwards to the early 20th century, to the middle of the 20th century onwards. Most interestingly, it's a kind of, I would say, in the case of South Calcutta, a rejection of neoclassicism. The Palladian arch, the kind of Corinthian pillars that you see in the big monumental buildings that the British Raj left behind. But the Bengalis were delving into all kinds of other styles, including Art Deco.
Art Deco.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there was a rejection of this neoclassical, self-delusional grandeur that the British Raj buildings had. Some of them are beautiful. I'm not saying that they're all awful. But there is something kitschy about neoclassicism, or as Ruskin called it, imbecilic about neoclassicism. But these houses, these residential houses, are full of idiosyncrasy and energy.
And that gives them a level of, I think, authenticity, which is missing in these larger sort of edifices, which are very sort of self-aggrandizing and pompous.
Authenticity without being utopian. I mean, you cannot say, looking at these houses, that this is a real, true blue Indian house, like let's say the Birla Temple is, which is a piece of kitsch. Whenever you become utopian in anything, you do produce kitsch. And these houses are not, they are non-kitschy, they are extremely alive. But they are being destroyed by promoters. Soon we will have no evidence left of this remarkable history in architecture. So one is trying to get the KMC to realize this. We took them to court even. Now we are working with them. But they people here, especially the bureaucracy, does live on a different planet. It's not just to do with what we can do or can't do. It's also to do with not knowing, not having any sense of the significance of these buildings, as if speaking about the significance of this. To speak about their significance would mean to be from another planet.
I mean, more than priorities and budget and execution and implementation, it comes down to something more fundamental, more primal. It's sensibilities. I mean, either you have that, in which case you're open to the possibility of, okay, this is probably something should be done about it, or you don't, in which case it's difficult to bring about that convergence.
Decades, but we haven't noticed them. Obviously, some kind of efflorescence produced them in the first place. They were built in a collaboration and a partnership between builders and owners who obviously were very playful in their ideas of what their home should look like, and they somehow made these structures work. Some of these owners were civil engineers, but they behaved like architects when it came to designing the houses they would live in. Nowadays, the architects have begun to behave like civil engineers.
The other way around, yes.
Yeah. In fact, architecture is a kind of training in civil engineering in many of the departments. For them to understand that there's a kind of aesthetic joy or imaginative joy in architecture is news to many architecture students. But maybe that here in Calcutta, but maybe that is changing. I hope it is changing. But yeah, that's one is racing against time.
Well, on that note of hope and optimism, however tenuous, we will conclude this discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, Amit, as always, and hope to have many more addas, hopefully some of them in person sometime later this millennium. And viewers, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I, for one, was absolutely fascinated. See you again with another guest next week. Until then, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye. Bye-bye.